if you know what your listener wants and you feed them a steady diet that responds to what they want, you've got them. I mean, you've got them. And very simply, it's not what they need, but what they want.
This Audience Summit is brought to you in partnership with Podcast Notes, the best ideas from the world's best podcasts in minutes.
Joe, welcome to the Grow Your Podcast Audience Summit brought to you by the Lewis and Kyle Show. We're excited to have you on as a contributor.
Hey, I'm happy to be here. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. Real quick, for those watching or listening or wherever they're at who aren't familiar with yourself and or your show, can you introduce yourself, talk about your podcast, the when and why you started it, and what the mission is?
Sure. So basically what I did was I started the podcast as a way of democratizing training, development, inspiration, and education for people that run the various types of resource groups that you see in organizations. And they have different names for them. They call them affinity groups, ERGs, BRGs, and I've heard a couple of other more exotic names also along the way. And in the past, most of the people who ran these groups were pretty passionate about what they were doing, whether running a veterans group or some other type of group. And they came into it with passion and looking for skills and training and development. And the only time they got that was if they were lucky enough to be given the opportunity to go to a conference, hear speakers, sit in on some of the breakout sessions and so forth. And that didn't happen for everybody in the organization, obviously. So if you have multiple groups, you might send maybe one or two people out. And in theory, they're going to come back and they're going to share with everybody else, but that never happens because they have day jobs. And once they get back, they go back to doing whatever they were doing. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to make that type of education that they only got in these breakout groups or when they went to these conferences, I wanted to make it something that they could get from anywhere on any device at any time. And originally, I actually started out with the idea of creating a virtual university. That seemed and still is something, it's something actually I'm doing now, but at the time it was a little bit too ambitious. So I scaled back and I said, what about a podcast? And lo and behold, the podcast took off, ended up having thousands of listeners in a short period of time. And from that podcast, I actually got the sponsors and the learning partners and leveraged them to build that learning academy. That was the original idea that I came out of the gate with.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And it's, it's been successful. And that's why we're excited to have you on as a contributor, talking about kind of some of the tactics and reasons why you think the podcast was successful. So the first question for you, right along those lines, what has been the most effective marketing channel for growing your show and how have you used it?
So right out of the gate, the most effective thing that helped me was that, as we were talking before we started recording, I had built a pretty impressive community. And I had built that community by offering tips and offering my weekly letter where I talk about different things that I'm reading. And I especially am interested in signals as to where the future of diversity, equity, and inclusion are going in a world that's becoming a little more run by AI and run by various other technologies and tools. And so I had this big audience already. And so when I announced that I was going to start doing this podcast, I basically went to that group first, and they in turn told the people who worked in their organizations who had these roles. One of the hard things about reaching people, by the way, listeners in my particular space, is that there is no mailing list of people who are ERG, BRG, or affinity group leaders. There's no such thing that you can go out there and get. But if you know the people inside the organizations who actually run the operations and fund these groups, then they become your channel to reaching the end audience. So that got me started with a pretty decent audience pretty quickly. And then the other thing was Facebook ads. I used Facebook ads that were targeted based on my estimate that most people that were running these groups belonged to certain demographics, were in a certain age group. And I put up a Facebook page. And what I would do is I would post episodes to that Facebook page. And in return, I would then take those ads and take those postings and promote them into ads. That would bring people to that page who would then jump on the podcast. They would tell other people and so forth. So that turned out to be that initial kernel of having all those people in the beginning, plus then the Facebook ads, turned out to be the way to build an audience pretty quickly. So I started out only in the United States with an immediate group of people that were in my community. And now I am in the United States, Canada, the UK, New Zealand, and Australia.
Well, that's fantastic, both for you and for this audience summit, because, those are answers that we haven't yet heard. But the second question for you is, what are some underrated tactics that you've used to attract listeners to your show?
So one underrated tactic that I use that actually came from listener feedback. So one of the things that I learned early, just having conversations with people that were sponsoring the show and who were, users of the show, whose people were listening to the show, was that in some organizations, they were using the show as a conversation starter. So what they would do is they would have all the people that belong to a particular network listen to an episode where the guests were talking about how they use operating these groups as a means of developing leaders for the future, or developing their own leadership skills. And so they would listen to that episode as a team, and then they would get together and they would talk about, how can we apply that here? How can we use our groups to do what this person on this podcast was talking about? And the same thing with other podcasts on a host of different topics. So I took that information and I made a podcast out of it where I talked about, how can you use this podcast? And I offered out a lot of different ideas that other people were already using. And I basically listed out, this is how you do it step by step, conversation starter. You can use it also when you're going to have a meeting, let's say with an executive sponsor, and you want that executive sponsor to know something about the topic before you jump into the meeting. So stuff like that. That turned out to be a boon in terms of increasing my audience, because as more people started using it as a tool in the organization to do things like that, they brought more listeners. And then those listeners would go sign up so they could have their own steady stream of podcasts coming in. They would listen to the past episodes and then they would recommend them to another group. So the more people that use them in groups, the more it started to spread out to a larger and larger group. And I think that's an underrated tactic that just about anybody can use. Whatever audience that you talk to, if you could figure out ways, and maybe some of them are already doing this, and you could pick up those ways from some of those users that are, on the leading edge of leveraging your material, how they use it in a way to get the most out of it. And then you create a podcast or materials that you put out there that teach people, how do you make better use of this? How do you get more bang for the buck for your subscription to this podcast?
No, I think that's great. That's something that, similar things have come up in a couple of these interviews, is we don't realize as the creators of these podcasts, just how so many forms of adjacent value creation you could come out of just with the work you've already done if you just apply it in one extra way. So, we interviewed Jordan Harbinger, who does hundreds of interviews, and for a 2-hour conversation with a really high energy, high impact person, you can't just listen to that and then all of a sudden lead to all the behavior change from these people's ideas. So he makes worksheets. It sounds like, yourself, with a very specific show, with a very specific educational purpose, it's a lot to expect someone to just listen to it and be able to remember all of the great ideas. And if you create those resources, like, I made this amazing thing and here's how you make the most of it, they're more likely to fully understand just how much awesome stuff went into it and actually realize the value and then want to come back. So that's great.
Yeah. And one thing I'll add to that is that in addition to the podcast on how to use the podcast, I also created a catalog, which is like a 3-page, 4-page PDF. Now it's probably 6 or 7 pages. And I update it on a regular basis. So every time I do a new episode, it just basically has the episode title, the URL, and then it says a little bit about what that episode is about in terms of what skill or what inspiration or what it does. And I posted that to my podcast website. And I also mention it so that if you want to create a curriculum for discussion purposes, you can go and download the document and you can kind of pick and say, well, I want this episode, and this episode. And then we'll have a discussion around that, do some brainstorming, and then we can use that to do whatever project it is that you're prepping everybody for. So that's kind of an example along the lines of what you just said, of creating a tool that then allows them to better leverage the podcast.
I think that's a really great idea. And I also think that's great for creators that don't have, one specific niche, because, they say you have to make it about one thing or whatever, but no, you can cover all sorts of topics and then guide people to say, I've made all of these things, but just here's how you can pick and choose based on what makes sense for you. So it allows you as the creator to cover everything you want to cover without making any irrelevant materials for someone who only has a very specific use case. So that's
Exactly.
hugely valuable. Third question here. So you've attracted a large audience. Many people are listening to your show, and there's in many ways some inherent viral loops based on the social sharing that's coming out of it. But in what ways have you turned all the people that have found your show into fans? So how have you kept the same people coming back?
Well, here's the thing. I think that for me, that was easier than it might be for others, because I do have sort of like this niche audience, and they are looking for a specific skill set. They want to know, how do I put a strategy together? How do I attract more members into this group? How do I leverage what I'm doing here in my spare time, so to speak, if we can use that term these days? How can I use that in order to improve myself? What are the value propositions that I can put out there that will garner me even more members and so forth? So this is a group of people that really started out with passion and want now the skills to be able to turn their dream into a reality, as it were. And so what I'm offering them on a regular basis is really very straightforward how-to. How do you do this? How do you put a strategy together? How do you get this value out of this? So I'm talking to what they want. And I think that's the most powerful thing, is if you know what your listener wants and you feed them a steady diet that responds to what they want, you've got them. I mean, you've got them. And very simply, it's not what they need, but what they want. Like, for example, I'll give you a quick story to exemplify what I mean. You could have two guys that walk out of their, two people, men or women, that walk out of their, in the morning, walk up to their car, and, one person notices that their car tires are going a little bald, and that they probably should get other tires. So they need new tires. But then when they start thinking about, gee, I'm going to be at that garage or that tire place all day, and it's going to take most of my Saturday, I'll put it off. I think that I can get away with another month or so out of these tires. Then you have the other person who just comes out of a showroom with a brand new car with brand new tires. And as they're driving their brand new car, they look and they see another car like theirs, brand new also. But this car has these specialty tires with different white walls. And with the coloring of the car and everything, it looks fantastic. And that person immediately makes this leap, that in their mind, this emotional connection, and they say, you know what, I want those tires. And so they make an appointment and they go out to get those new tires. Now, person A needs tires, but person B wants tires, and want drives action. Whereas need, not so much sometimes. So a lot of times it's really a matter of knowing what is it that your audience wants, and then meeting that want. Not so much a need, but the want that they. And so I think that we've done that pretty successfully, primarily because I get a lot of input from people that are audience members or work with audience members, and they're telling me what they want. And I dig for that. And then the other is the story I told you before about finding different ways for them to use it. So by helping them to figure out how to use it, it just increases the stickiness of their coming back and possibly listening again and giving it to someone else and so forth. And that grows the fan base.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really powerful illustration and really powerful for you to be able to leverage, because, your audience is such a specific customer avatar of a person that you kind of know what they need, and then it's just on you to figure out what they want. So it's a little different framing, I think, like you were saying, than most podcasters, just because of the nature of your podcast and what you're talking about. So that's great. So question for you is, if you could start your show over again, what would you do differently to grow it more effectively?
Well, I will tell you, if I could start all over again, the story that I told you before about how to use it, I started that probably toward the end of my first season, beginning of my second season, maybe a bit into my second season already. I would have done that earlier. I think, because I think that was a big lever when I started doing that, that's when I started seeing more and more activity. I think that we often take it for granted, especially when we're very close to something and we really enjoy something or are passionate about a particular topic. We take it for granted that everybody else who hears us talk about it or sees this particular product or service automatically knows how valuable it is and that they can use it 15 or 14 different ways. And I think we can't do that. What we have to do is from the very beginning, and that's what I would do if I could make a phone call to my earlier self and kind of tell them what to do to start this, is up front, very early on, tell people how to get as much value out of your podcast as possible. Again, addressing what they want and how they can get more of what they want out of your podcast. They want to improve their career. They want to improve their business. And that's what people buy. People buy things to meet wants. And so, so I would do that up front. That would have been my there's probably a couple of other things, but that's the one that stands out because when I did it, and I saw what was happening, I said to myself, I wish I had done this from the very beginning.
Well, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a very valuable insight that, we should also keep in mind ourselves, just based on the listener data that we have, what can we learn from it? And I think that's super valuable for any creator to do. Last question for you. If you had $1,000 marketing budget for your show, how do you spend the money? So I know you've shared in question one that you do some Facebook ads, but is there any other way you would use an additional $1,000 free marketing budget from courtesy of Lewis and Kyle to get some additional attention for the things that you're doing?
When you asked that question, when I first looked at that question, I thought, here's something I would do. And then I went one step further and said, heck, I'm just going to take the money and do it. Right? And what I would do is I would go out there, and it's not expensive to do this. I would go out there and I would buy like those coffee mugs and put the podcast logo and something about the podcast on it, and then give those to all of my sponsors and some of the top listeners that I have and so forth, because every time they're having that cup of coffee, they're advertising me. And I operate primarily inside a lot of corporate circles. So the only thing that's putting me off from doing that right now is I'm going to wait until the vaccine becomes available and people actually start going back to the office right now. Otherwise, they'll be sitting on Zoom calls like this and you'll never see my little cup of coffee, that says on it, ERG Power Talk. So that's what I would do. I mean, I think that you have to look for, I think any money that you get that you want to advertise, you have to find out, first of all, like who is my listener? Where are they? And where do I need to be visible to them? And in this particular case, my particular listener is in the corporate world, and anything that I can do to be able to make them aware, raise awareness, they hear about it. To your point, I think you made the point before, I think Kyle made the point before about how many times you have to tell people things or you have to show people things. I think that hearing about it, using it, seeing it on a coffee, all of these different things are points of contact in order to get through, because let's face it, there are lots of podcasts out there. There's lots of YouTube stuff going on. There are a lot of other programs, and there's Netflix streaming, and there are documentaries. There's so much that's vying for attention that you have to cut through all that with something that basically says, this is for you. So I think that message is important. And then you just have to find out where to put that message. So that's where I would put your grant.
Well, I really like that, and I would want one of those coffee mugs from you. So if you end up doing it, make sure you send one to.
You got it.
Kyle.
You got it. You guys got it.
Well, Joe, thank you very much for coming on our summit and sharing your wisdom from your years of podcasting. If any of the people listening and want to connect with you and want to find your podcast, where should we send them?
Well, the podcast is ERG Power Talk, and you can get it on Apple or whatever your favorite podcast app is. And as far as reaching me, you can find me on LinkedIn. Joe at joesantana.com is my email address, so that's another way that you can get me as well. And I'm always happy to chat, share, and learn. And I'm looking forward to hearing the program so I can hear what some of my fellow podcasters talked about, and maybe glean some fresh ideas from them as well.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching this interview. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please subscribe to our channel right here on YouTube. And if you feel like you learned something, share this episode on social media to help us grow our audience as well.